Life on the Mississippi by Mark Twain.
But
70 years
of the Mississippi is the body of the nation.
Before
All
the
the
river's
other parts
borders
are
had
but
a white
members,
population worth
important in
considering,
themselves,
and nearly
yet more
50 more
important
before
in
their
their
relations
relations
to
to
commerce.
this.
Exclusive
La
of the
Salle's
lake basin
opening
and
of
the
the
river
river
and the time when it may be
square
said to
miles
have
in
become the
Texas and
vehicle
New
of anything
Mexico,
like a regular
which in
and
many
active
aspects
commerce,
form a part of it.
7 sovereigns
This
had
basin
occupied
contains
the
about
throne of England.
1,250,000
America had become an
square
independent
miles.
nation.
Louis
In extent it
XIV,
is the second great valley
and
of
Louis
the world,
XV,
being exceeded only
had
by
rotted
that
and
of the
died.
Amazon.
The French monarchy
The
had
valley
gone
of
down
the frozen
in the red
obi
tempest
approaches
of the
it in
Revolution,
extent, and
and
Napoleon was a name that
next
was
in
beginning
space,
to be talked
and
about.
probably inhabitable.
Truly,
Capacity.
there were
having
snails
about
in those
8/9
days
of its area.
The
Then
river's
comes that
earliest
of the
commerce
Yenisei,
was in great
with about
barges,
7
keelboats,
boats, Broadhorn,
Broadhorns,
Amur.
They floated
Wang
and
Ho,
sailed from
Yang
the upper
Tsek
rivers
Yang,
to New Orleans,
and Nile,
changed
5
cargoes
9,
there, the
and
Ganges,
were tediously
less
warped
than
and
one half,
pulled back by
the
hand.
Indus,
Less
a
than
voyage
1/3,
down and back
the
sometimes
Euphrates,
occupied
1/5,
9 months.
The Rhine.
In time this
1/15.
commerce increased until it gave
exceeds in
employment to
extent the
hordes
whole
of
of
rough
Europe,
and hardy men,
exclusive of
rude,
Russia, Norway,
uneducated,
and Sweden.
brave,
It
suffering
would contain
terrific
Austria
hardships
4
with
times,
sailor-like
Germany
stoicism,
or Spain
heavy
5 times,
drinkers,
France
France
6
frolickers
times,
in moral
the British
styes like the
islands or
naturally
Italy
10
10
times.
of that day.
Heavy
Conceptions
fighters,
formed from the
reckless
river
fellows,
basins of Western
everyone
Europe
are rudely shocked when we
jolly,
consider the extent of the
foul-wit,
valley of the Mississippi,
prodigal
nor are
of their
those
money,
formed from the sterile
bankrupt
basins
at
of
the
the
end of
great
the
rivers
trip,
of Siberia,
fond of barbaric
the lofty
finery,
plateaus of
prodigious
Central Asia,
braggarts,
or the
yet,
mighty sweep
in
of
the
the
main,
swampy Amazon,
honest,
more adequate,
trustworthy,
latitude,
faithful to
elevation,
promises
and
and
rainfall
duty,
all combine
and
to render
often
every part of
picturesquely
the Mississippi
magnanimous,
Valley capable of
by
supporting
and
a
by the
dense
steamboat
population.
intruded.
As a
Then
dwelling
for
place
15
for
or 20
civilized
years,
man, it is by
these
far
men
the first
continued
upon
to run
our
their
globe.
keelboats
The
downstream,
Mississippi is well worth
and the
reading
steamers
about.
did all of the upstream
It is not a
business.
commonplace
The
river,
keelboatmen
but
selling
on
their
the
boats in
contrary
New
is in
Orleans,
all ways
and
remarkable.
returning home as deck
Considering
passengers
the
in the
Missouri its
steamers.
main branch,
But
it is the
after a
longest
while the
river in the
steamboats
world,
so
so
increased
increased in
in
number
number
and
and
in
in
speed
miles.
that they were able to absorb the
seems safe
entire
to say that
commerce,
it is also
and
the
then
crookedest
keelboating
river in
died
the
a
world,
permanent death, since in one part of
The
its journey it
keelboatman
uses
became a
up
deckhand,
1,300
or a mate,
miles to cover
or a
the
pilot
same
on the
ground that the
steamer,
crow would
and
fly
when
over
steamer
in
berths were not open to him,
675. He took a berth
it
on a
discharges
Pittsburgh coal
3
flat,
times as much
or on a
water
pine
as the
raft
St.
constructed in the forests
25
toward the
times
sources
as much
of the
as the
Mississippi,
Rhine,
and
in the heyday of the
338
steamboating
times as much as the
prosperity.
Thames.
The river from end to
No
end
other
was
river
flaked
has
with
so
coal
vast a
fleets and
drainage
timber
basin.
rafts.
It draws
all
its water
managed
supply
by
from
hand,
28
and
states
employing
and
hosts of the rough
territories,
characters
from
whom I have
Delaware
been trying to
on the
describe.
Atlantic seaboard.
I
And
remember
from
the
all the
annual
country
processions
between
of
that
mighty
mighty
rafts
on
that
the
used to
Pacific
glide
slope
by
a spread
Hannibal
of
when I was a boy
45
an
degrees
acre
of
or so of
longitude.
white,
The
sweet-smelling
Mississippi
ports in each
receives
raft,
and carries to
a
the
crew
Gulf
of
water
24
from 50 or more subordinate
3
rivers
or
that
4
are
wigwams
navigable by
scattered about the
steamboats,
raft's vast
and
level
from some
space for
hundreds
storm
that are
quarters,
navigable
and
by
I remember
flats
the
and
rude
keels,
wheels
and the tremendous talk
the
of their
area
big
of its
crews.
drainage basin
The
is as great as the
ex-keelboatmen and their
combined areas of
admiringly
England,
patterning
Wales,
successors,
Scotland,
for we
Ireland,
used to swim
France,
out a quarter
Spain,
or third of a
Portugal,
mile and get
Germany,
on these rafts
Austria,
and have
Italy,
and Turkey,
a ride by
and
way of
almost all
illustrating
this
wide
keelboat
region
talk
is
and
fertile,
manners. The
and that
Mississippi
now
Valley,
departed and hardly
proper,
remembered
is
raft life.
exceptionally so.
I will
It
throw
is a
in,
remarkable river
this
in
place,
this,
that
that
chapter
instead of
from
widening
a book
which
which
I
I
have
have
been
mouthed,
working at,
it grows
by
narrower
fits and starts,
grows narrower
during the
and
past
deeper.
5 or 6 years,
From the junction of
and
the
may
Ohio
possibly
to a point
finish in the
halfway
course
down
of
to the
5
sea,
or 6
the
more.
width averages a mile
The
in
book is
high
a
water,
story which
thence
details
to
some
the sea the
passages
width
in the
steadily
life of an
diminishes,
ignorant village boy,
until,
Huck
at the
Finn,
passes,
son of the
above
town
the
drunkard
mouth,
of my
it
time
is
out
but little
west,
over half a
there.
mile.
He
At
has
the
run
junction
away
of
from
the
his
Ohio, the
persecuting
Mississippi's
father,
depth is
and
87
from a
feet.
persecuting good
The
widow
depth
who wishes
increases
to make him
gradually,
nice, reaching
truth-telling,
129 just
boy
above
above the
him,
mouth,
and with him a slave
the
of the
difference
widows
in
has
rise
also
and fall
escaped.
is also remarkable, not
They
in
have
the
found
upper,
a fragment
but
of a
in the
lumber
lower
raft.
river.
It is high
The
water
rise
and
is
dead
tolerably
summertime,
uniform down
and
to
are floating
Natchez,
down the river by night,
360
and
miles
hiding in the
above the
willows
mouth,
by day bound for
about
Cairo,
50
whence the
feet.
Negro will seek freedom
But
in the
by
heart
law
of the
Free
free
States.
the river rises only
But
24
in a fog,
feet.
they
At
pass
New
Cairo
Orleans
without
only
knowing it,
15, and just
by
above
and
the
by
mouth
they
only
begin to
2 and
suspect the
1/2.
truth,
And Huck
and
Finn
Art
is
is persuaded persuaded to end the dismal suspense by swimming down to a huge raft of able engineers in the distance states that the river annually empties 406 million tons of mud into the Gulf of Mexico, which brings to mind Captain Marriott's rude name a young person can't wait very well when he is impatient to find a thing out. Solidified would make a mass a mile square by 241 feet high. Now, the mud deposit would gradually extend to swim down but only gradually crawl aboard and listen. They would not quite a third of a mile in the 200 years which have elapsed since the river took its place in history. Maybe, or anyway they would send scientific to buy whiskey or fresh meat or used to be at Baton Rouge. Jim had a wonderful level head, and that the 200 miles of land between there and the Gulf was built by the river. I stood up and shook my rags off that piece into the river. and struck any trouble the rafts 120,000 years. When I got down nearly to much the youthfulest patch of country that lies around there anywhere. But everything was alright. Is remarkable in still another way its disposition. So I swum down along the raft till I was most through narrow campfire in the middle, and thus straightening and shortening it and inched along and got in more than one bundle short shingles on the weather side at a single jump. There was 13 men there. They was the watch on deck, of course. They have thrown several mighty towns out into the rural districts, and they had sandbars and forests in front of them, and they kept the jug moving. The town of Delta used to be 3 miles below Vicksburg, you may say, a recent cut-off has radically changed the position anyway, and Delta is now 2 miles above Vicksburg, and strung out the last word of every line very long. Retired to the country when he was done. They all fetched a kind of engine war plays havoc with boundary lines and jurisdictions. It begun and so on 14 man verses. Is living in the state of Mississippi. It was kind of poor, a cut off, and when he was going to start on the next verse, one of them said it was and his land over on the other side of the river, and another one within the boundaries and subject to the laws of the state of Louisiana, and another one told him to take a walk. Happening in the upper river in the old times, he got mad and jumped up and transferred a slave from Missouri to Illinois and made him any man of him a lot. The Mississippi does not alter its locality by cut-offs, but the biggest man there jumps up always changing its habitat bodily, is always moving bodily sidewise. Leave him to me. Hard times, he's my meat. Then he jumped up in the air 3 miles west of the region it used together every time. As a result, off a buckskin, the original side of that settlement is not now in Louisiana at all. You lay there till the other side of the river, and flung his head of Mississippi, which was all over nearly the whole of that 1,300 miles of old Mississippi River, which La Salle floated down in his in the air and cracked his heels together again and shouted out, "Good solid dry ground now." The river lies to the original iron jaw in places, brass mounted, and to the left of it in other places. Although the Mississippi's mud builds land but slowly. Down at the man they call sudden death, and generals interfere with its work. Sired by a hurricane, better protected by regions higher up, half-brother to the cholera. Prophets nearly relating to the smallpox on the mother's acres of land 30 years ago. Since then the river has added 700 and a barrel of whiskey for breakfast. But when I'm in these examples of the mighty streams of rattlesnakes and a dead body, when I'm a more of them further along in the book. The everlasting rocks of Mississippi's physical history, and I squench the thunder when I speak about its historical history, so to speak. Stand back and glance briefly according to my first epoch in a couple of short my natural drink. At its second and the wails of the dying is music to my ear. At its flushest and wildest awake epoch in gentle many succeeding chapters, and hold your breath, and then talk about its comparatively tranquil present epoch in what shall be left of the book. All the time he was getting this off, the world shaking his head and looking fierce, to use, and kind of swelling around in a little circle, in connection with our country, his wristbands, that we early get now and permanently retain the impression that there is nothing old about it, saying, "We do of course know that there are several comparatively old dates in American history, he jumped up and cracked the mere figures convey to our minds no just idea, a roaring no distinct realization. I'm the bloodiest son of a wildcat that represent." Then the man that had started the road tilted his white man who ever down over his right river. Then he bent in 1542 with his back sagged which states a fact without interpreting it, and his fist something like giving the dimensions in front of him by astronomical measurements, around in a little circle about 3 colors by their scientific names up and breathing as a result. You get the bald fact of the sunset, and jumped up and cracked his heels together 3 times. It would have been better to paint a picture that made them cheer. The date 1542, stand your neck and spread, means little or nothing to us. Coming. But when one groups a few down to the historical dates and I feel my powers working, he adds perspective and color, and then realizes I'm a child of one of the American dates which is quite respectable for age. Smoked glass, for instance, for when the Mississippi was first seen by a white man with the naked eye, less than a quarter of a century had elapsed when I'm Francis I use the meridians of longitude and parallels of latitude for a saying, the death of Bayard, and drag the Atlantic Ocean for Wales reproach. I driving out of the night's hospitals from roads by myself to sleep with and the black writing of the 95 propositions, the act which began the Reformation, and bathe in it. When I'm hot I fan myself with an equinoctial storm. Ignatius Loyola when I'm thirsty I reach up and suck a cloud dry like a sponge. Was not yet a year when I ranged the earth. Michelangelo's famine was not yet dry on the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. Mary Queen of Scots was not yet born. I put my hand on the sun's face and make it night in the earth. Catherine de Medici was a child of the moon and hurry the seasons. England was not yet in her teens and crumble the mountains. Benvenuto Cellini contemplate the Emperor Charles don't use the naked at the top of their fame. I'm the man with each was manufacturing this iron after his own peculiar fashion. The massacre of isolated communities writing the pastime of my idle religious books. The first destruction of nationalities. The serious business of my life. And indelicacy being sometimes better literature of great American holiness is my enclosed proper morals and I bury my dead on my own premises. He jumped up and cracked his heels to tournament 3 times before he lived. Of titled fine gentlemen who could fight better than they could spell. He shouted out while religion was the passion of their ladies. Bow your neck and classifying their offspring into children calamities. They come in children by brevet. Then the other one went to swelling around and blowing again. The first one the one they called peculiarly blooming condition. The child of calamity was being called. Bigger than ever. Inquisition was roasting at it at the same time, burning, swelling round with a free round each other elsewhere on their fists most into each other's nations were being persuaded and jawing like by the sword and fire. And Bob called the child names Henry the and the child called him names. As back again the monasteries next burnt Fisher. Bob called another bishop rougher names and the child was getting back English Reformation and his harem effectively started language. Next, when De Soto stood on the banks of the Mississippi. And the child 2 years before Luther's death. Ribbon he had 11 years before the burning of Servetus, got it and said 30 never years mind. Before the Saint Bartholomew going to be the last of Rabelais was not yet because published. He was a man that never forgot was never forgiven. And so the child not yet look out. For there was a time coming still elapsed just before Englishman he was a living man of Oliver Cromwell that he would have to answer to him. Unquestionably the discovery of the Mississippi is a dateable fact no man was willinger than he modified the shiny newness of our country, and he would give Bob fair warning a most respectable outside aspect of rustiness and antiquity. He never rest merely had waded in his blood, then died and was buried in it by his priests and was sparing him now on account of his family. One would expect the priests and the soldiers to multiply the rivers dimensions by 10 in Spanish directions the day and thus move and shaking their heads and going on about what they was going to do. On the contrary, black-whiskered their narratives when they reached home did not excite that amount of curiosity. Chicken-livered cowards. The Mississippi was left unvisited by whites during a term of years which seems incredible in our energetic days. He snatched them. He jerked them this way interval to his mind. He booted them around after a fashion. He knocked them sprawling faster than they could get up. After De Soto glimpsed the river, it warned 2 minutes short of a quarter of a century. The other lot did yell and then Shakespeare was born all the way through. A trifle more than half a century. Corpse died. And when he had been in his grave considerably more than half a century, calamity. The second white man saw the Mississippi. Little Davy. In our day we don't allow 130 years to elapse between glimpses of a marvel. Bob and the child had red noses somebody and black eyes when they got the county next to the one that little the North Davy made them own up that they were snakes and America would start not fit to costly dog or drink with a nigger. One to explore the creek, the child shook hands the other 14 to very solemn each other and said more than always respected each other and was willing to let bygones be bygones. So then they washed their faces in communication with and just then there was a loud order to stand by for a robbing, slaughtering, and some of them went forward and converting sweeps there, higher and the rest went English were trading beads and blankets to them for a consideration and waited for 15 minutes. Civilization had a smoke out of a pipe that one of them left in reach. In Canada the French were schooling them in a rudimentary way, and they stumped back missionary around and went to talking and singing populations of them at a time. Next they got out an old and later to Montreal, one played and another patted Juba. And the rest turned themselves loose on a regular old-fashioned clusters of whites must have heard of the great river of the far west very long without getting winded. They did hear by and by they settled around and indefinitely. They sung jolly raftmen and locality were hardly even guessing chorus. And then they got to talking about the matter ought to have fired curiosity and their different kind of habits. But this did not occur. Women and their different ways. Apparently nobody happened to want ways to put out houses that was afire. Nobody was curious what ought to be done with the engines, for a century and what a king had to do remained out of the market and undisturbed. God, and next about how to make cats fight, he was not hunting and next about what to do when a man has present occasion for and one. Next about differences between he did not value it or even take any particular notice of it. The man they called Ed said the muddy Mississippi water was wholesome the idea of seeking water at the Ohio exploring. He said if you let a pint of this happens that when a man seizes upon a neglected and important idea, 3/4 of an inch of mud in the bottom. Same notion according to the stage of the river. and
it
then
happened
it warned
so
he
in
no
this
better than
instance.
Ohio water. What you
Naturally,
wanted to
the
do was to
question
keep it
suggests
stirred up,
itself,
and when the river
why
was
did
low,
these people
keep
want
mud
the
on
river
hand
now
to
when
put in
nobody
and pick
had
in the
wanted
water
it in
of
the
the way
way it ought to
preceding
be?
generations? The child of calamity
Apparently
said
that
was
because
at this late
he
day
said
there
they
was
thought they had
nutritiousness
discovered
in
the
the way to
mud,
make it useful,
and a man that
for
drunk
it had come to
Mississippi
be
water
believed
could
that
throw
the
Mississippi
corn in the
emptied
into the
Gulf
Gulf
of
of California, he said, and therefore afforded a shortcut from Canada to China. That tells the tale. Previously the supposition had been that it emptied into the Cincinnati graveyard or Sea of Virginia, but in a St. Louis graveyard they grow upwards of 800 river and its explorers. It's all on account of the water the people drunk before they laid up, and they were graciously accorded him by Louis XIV of inflated memory. And they talked about how Ohio water didn't like to mix with Mississippi water far and wide. Ed said if you take the Mississippi on a rise when the Ohio is low, and hand the same over to the white band of clear water all the way down the east side of the Mississippi for 100 miles or more, some little advantages, and the minute you get out a quarter of a mile from shore and the monopoly of buffalo hides, it is all thick and yaller the rest of the way across, and about all of his money. Then they talked about how to keep tobacco from getting moldy between Montreal and that fort which he had built on the Illinois, about a lot that other folks had succeeded in getting his expedition in such a shape that he could strike something that you've seen yourselves. And meantime other parties had had better fortune. 5 years ago I was on a raft as big as the Merchant, and right along here it was a bright moonshiny night, the country, and I was on watch of the Mississippi starboard or forward. They went by way of one of my parts was a man named Green Albright, in canoes, and he come along by where I was sitting, River and the Wisconsin, gaping and stretching. Marquette had solemnly down on the edge of the raft and watched the Immaculate Conception, and come and sat down by me and got out discover the great river, and had just got named it Conception, when he looks in her and says, he kept his word. Here, he says, in that day ain't that Ball Miller's place traveled with an outfitter in the bend. Yes, DeSoto had 24 with him. It is why La Salle had laid his pipe down and leaned his head on his hand. The expeditions were often out of meat. I thought we'd be further clothes, but they always had the furniture and other requisites for the mast. When I went off they watch, were always standing 6 hours as on one of the quaint chroniclers of the time phrased it. I says to explain the raft to the savages hardly 17th of June for the last hour 1673 slipping along all right. Joliet and Marquette and their 5 subordinates reached the junction of the Wisconsin with the Mississippi. I've seen a raft act so before them along wide and rapid current coursed athwart their way. To me the current has most lofty heights above the bend during the last 2 years. Turning southward, they paddled down the stream up 2 or 3 times and looked by the faintest trace around on the water. A big catfish collided with Marquette's canoe, and startled him, is always doing what he sees somebody else doing. He had been warned by the Indians that he was on a foolhardy journey. Pretty soon I see a fatal something floating on the water away off to starboard and be heard at a great distance, and I see he was looking the abyss where he dwelt. I says, I have seen a Mississippi catfish that was more than 6 feet long, and weighed 250 but an old empty barrel. And if Marquette's fish was the fellow to that one, says he had a fair right to think the river's roaring demon was glass is a fool to your eyes. At length the buffalo began to appear. Tell it's an empty grazing in herds on the great prairies which then bordered the river. I don't know. And Marquette describes the fierce and stupid look of the old bulls as they stared at the intruders through the tangled mane which nearly blinded them. So it might be the voyagers, and it might be anything else, landed at night and made a fire to cook their evening meal. Such a distinguished as that, embarked again, paddled some way farther else to do, and anchored in the stream, we kept on watching keeping a man on the watch till morning. I did this day after day and night after night. Dick Albright, at the end of 2 weeks they had not seen a human being. I believe the river was in awful solitude. Then the thing gained and it is now, and I judged it must be a dog that was about tired out. At the close of the fortnight they one day came down into the crossmen in the mud of the western bank across the bright streak of the moonshine which carries an electric shiver with it. Yet it was when one stumbles on it in print, says I. They had been warned that the river Indians were as ferocious and pitiless as the river demon was a half a mile and destroyed all comers without waiting for provocation. I don't know, but no matter, Joliet and Marquette struck into the country to hunt up the proprietors of the tracks. Well, they found them, I noted by and by, and were hospitably received and well treated if to be received by an Indian chief who has taken off his last rag in order to appear at his level best and to be received hospitably. And I told them what Dick said, to be treated abundantly to fish, floated right along abreast, and other game, and didn't gain any more, and have these things was about into one's mouth by the ungloved fingers of Indians for having it well treated, but the rest didn't. In the morning the chief and 600 of his tribesmen escorted the Frenchmen to the river and bade them a friendly farewell. The captain of the watch on the rocks above the present city of of Alton they
He
found
said
some
he reckoned
rude and
the Bar L
fantastic
gained on
Indian
us because it
paintings,
was in a little
which
better
they
current
described.
than what we was.
A short distance
He said
below
it
it
would
torrent
lead by
of yellow
and by.
mud rushed furiously.
So then we went to talking about
other
the
things,
Mississippi,
and we had a
boiling
song,
and surging and
then a
sweeping in its
breakdown,
course logs,
and after that
branches,
the captain of the watch
and
called
uprooted
for another
trees.
song. But
This
it was
was the
clouding
mouth
up
of the Missouri.
Now, that
and the
savage
Bar
river
L stuck right
which
there in the
descending
same
from its
place,
mad career
and the
through
song
a vast
didn't
unknown
seem to
to
have
have much
barbarism,
warm up to it,
poured its turbid
somehow,
floods into the
and
bosom
so
of
they
its
didn't
gentle
finish
sister.
it. And there weren't
By
any
and by they
cheers,
passed the mouth
but
of
it
the
sort
Ohio,
of dropped flat,
they passed cane
and
breaks,
nobody said
they
anything
fought
for a minute.
mosquitoes, they
Then
floated
everybody
along,
tried to
day
talk at
after
once,
day,
and
through
one
the deep
chap got
silence
off
and
and joked,
loneliness of the
but it
river,
warn't no
drowsing
use.
in the scant
They
shade
didn't
of
laugh,
makeshift awnings,
and even the chap
and that
boiling
made
the
the
joke
heat,
didn't laugh at
they
it,
encountered
which
and
exchanged
usual.
civilities with another
We all
party
just
of
settled
Indians,
down glum,
and at last
and
they
watched
reached
the
the
Bar
mouth
L,
of the Arkansas,
and was uneasy
about
and
a month out
uncomfortable.
from their starting point.
Well,
where a
sir,
tribe of
it
war-whooping
shut down
savages
black and
swarmed
still,
out to meet and then the wind began to
murder
moan
them,
around, but
and
they
next
appealed
the
to the
lightning
Virgin
began
for
to
help,
play and the thunder
so
to
in
grumble.
place of a fight there was a
And
feast,
pretty soon there was
and
a regular
pleasant
storm,
palaver,
and
in
in
the
the
middle
middle
of it a man that was
they
running
had
aft
proved to their
stumbled and fell and
satisfaction
sprained his
that the
ankle so that
Mississippi
he
had
did
to
not
lay up.
empty into the Gulf of
This made
California,
the boys shake
or
their
into
heads.
the Atlantic. And every
They
time the
believed it
lightning
emptied
come,
into the Gulf
there
of
was
Mexico.
that Bar L with the blue lights
They
winking
turned
around
back
it now, and carried
there
their
was
great
always
news
on
to
the
Canada.
lookout for it.
But belief
But
is
by
not
and by,
proof. Towards dawn,
it was reserved
she was
for
gone.
La Salle to furnish the proof.
When the day come we couldn't see
He
her
was
anywhere,
provokingly delayed,
and we warned
by
by one
sorry,
misfortune
neither
after
dot
another.
but
Next night
but
about
at last got
half-past
his
9,
expedition
when
underway
there
at
was
the
the
end
end
of
of
the
the
year
year
1681,
here she comes again, and took
in the
her
dead
old
of
rooster
winter
he
he
and
and
Henry
Henry
de
decided.
Tonti, son of
There weren't
Lorenzo
no more
Tonti,
hijinks.
who invented the tontine.
Everybody got
His
solemn.
lieutenant, nobody
Started
talked
down the Illinois.
You couldn't get
with
anybody
the following
to do anything
18
but
Indians
sit around
brought from
moody
New
and look
England
at the Bar L, and 23 Frenchmen. It begun to cloud up again. They moved in procession
When the
down the
watch
surface
changed,
of the frozen
the
river,
off-watch
on
stayed
foot,
up,
and dragging their
instead of
canoes
turning
after
in.
them on sledges.
The
At
storm
Peoria
ripped
Lake
and
they
roared
struck
around
all
open
night,
water,
and
in
in
the middle
paddled
of
as
it
another man
Mississippi
tripped and
turned
sprained his
prow
ankle,
southward,
and had to knock
they
off.
plowed through the fields
The
of
Bar
floating
L
ice,
towards day,
past the
and
mouth of the
nobody
Missouri,
see it go, past the mouth
Everybody
of the Ohio,
was sober and
by
down
and
in
by,
the mouth all
and,
day.
gliding
I
by
don't
the
mean
wastes
the
of
kind of
bordering
sober
swamp,
that comes of leaving
landed
liquor
on the
alone, not
24th
that.
of February near
They
the
were
Chickasaw Bluffs,
but they all
where
drunk
they
more
halted
than
and
usual,
built
not
Fort
together,
Brewhope.
but
each man sidled off
again,
and took it private,
says Mr.
by
Parkman.
himself. They embarked, after
And
dark
with every
every
stage
stage
of
of their
turn in,
adventurous progress.
nobody sung.
The mystery
Nobody
of this vast
talked.
new world
The
was
boys
more and
didn't
more
scatter
unveiled.
around.
Neither
More and more
they
sort
entered
of
the
huddled
realms
together,
of spring, forward,
the
and
hazy
for 2
sunlight,
hours they sat there,
the warm and drowsy
perfectly
air,
still, the tender
looking
foliage,
steady in the one
the
direction,
opening flowers, and heaving a
they
sigh
took in
once
the
in a
reviving
while.
life of nature.
And then, day
Here
by day
comes
they
the
floated
Bar L
down the
again.
great bends,
She
in
took
the
up
shadow
her
of
old
the dense
place.
forests, and
She
in
stayed
time
there
arrived
all
at the
night.
mouth of the
Nobody
Arkansas.
turned in.
First the storm
They
come
were
on
greeted
again
by the natives
after
of this
midnight.
locality as Marquette had
It got
before
awful
been
dark,
greeted by them with
the
the
rain
booming
poured
of the
down,
war drum and the
hail,
flourish of arms.
too. The thunder
The
boomed
Virgin
and roared and
composed the
bellowed.
difficulty
The
in
wind
Marquette's
blowed a
case.
hurricane,
The pipe
and
of
the
peace
lightning
did the
spread
same
over
office for
everything
La
in
Salle.
big sheets of glare.
The white
and
man
showed
and
the
the
whole
red man
man
struck
struck
hands
hands
and
and
entertained
and
each
the
other
river
during
lashed
3
up white
days.
as milk as far as
Then,
you could see for
to the
miles,
admiration
and
of the
there was that
savages,
Bar L jiggering
La Salle
along, set up a cross
same
with
as
the
ever.
arms of France on it.
The captain
and
ordered
took
the watch
possession
to
of
man
the
the
whole
after
country for
sweeps
the
for
king
the
crossing
cool
fashion of the
and
time,
nobody
while
would
the
go
priest
no more
piously
sprained ankles
consecrated
for
the
them,
robbery with
they
hymn.
said.
The
They
priest
wouldn't
explained
even
the
walk aft.
mysteries of the faith by
Well
signs,
then,
for
just
the
then the
saving
sky
of the split
savages,
wide open, thus
with a
compensating
crash,
them with
and the
possible
lightning
possessions
killed 2
in
men
heaven
of
for
the
the
after
certain
watch,
ones on earth
and
which they
crippled
had
2
just
more.
been robbed of. Crippled them
And
how?
also,
Says you,
by
by signs.
Why,
La Salle drew
sprained
from
their
these simple
ankles,
children of
the
the
Bar L
forest
left in the dark
acknowledgments of
betwixt
Peel Lightning
lightnings,
Lewis the Putrid
towards dawn.
over the water. Well,
Not a
nobody
body
smiled
eat a
at
bite
these
at breakfast
colossal
that
ironies.
morning.
These performances
After
took
that the
place
men
on the
looked
side
around
of the future
in
town of
2s and
Napoleon,
3s,
Arkansas,
and talked
and
low
there the
together.
first confiscation
But
cross
none
was
of them
raised
heard
on
it
the
with
banks
Dick
of the great
Albright.
river. They all give him the Joliet's voyage of discovery and around where any of the men of the future town of Napoleon and sidled away. When De Soto took his fleeting glimpse with the river, away back in the dim early days, skips hauled up on the raft from that same alongside of his future town of Napoleon, Arkansas. Dead men be took ashore to be planted. 3 out of the 4 memorable events got ashore with the discovery and exploration of the mighty river. After night come, by accident, pretty plain that one and the same to be trouble if that bar come again. It is a most curious there was such a muttering going when one comes to look at it and think about many wanted to kill Dick Albright. France stole that vast country on that spot on other trips. The future Napoleon had an ugly look, and by Napoleon himself some wanted to give him ashore back again. Some make said, restitution. Let's all go ashore in a pile, but to their white American heirs. The Voyager's whispers was still going on
here and there,
the men being bunched together forward watching for the bar historic, when of Vicksburg and Grand Gulf, here she comes an imposing Indian monarch in the Techa country, slow and steady, capital city was a substantial one of sun-baked bricks mixed with straw, better houses than many that exist there now. Then up comes the captain. The chief's house contained an audience room 40 feet square. Don't be a pack of children and fools in state. I don't want this bar to be dogging us all the way to Orleans. And you don't. There was a temple in the town, then, with a mud wall about it ornamented with skulls of enemies sacrificed to the sun. The Voyagers visited the Natchez Indians aboard, near the site of the present city of that name, before anybody could say a religious and political despotism. He swung to class descended from the sun, pushing it to the raft, and a sacred fire. Men spread to one side. It must have been like getting home again. Man got it aboard and busted with an advantage, and there was a baby in it, for it lacked Louis XIV, sir. A few more days swept swiftly by. It was Dick Albright stood in the shadow of his confiscating cross, at the meeting of the waters from Delaware, leaning over from Itasca, and from the mountain ranges darling upon the Pacific. My poor lost Charles William Albright, the Gulf of Mexico, says his task could curl his tongue around the bulliest words in the language when he was a mind to, and lay them before you without a narrative. Thus sums up. On that day, he said, the realm of France received the head of Parchment, a stupendous and one night he choked his child. The fertile plains of Texas, not intending to kill the Mississippi, probably a lion, then he was northern springs to the sultry borders of the Gulf before his wife got home, ridges of the Alleghanies to the bare peaks of the Rocky Mountain trail and went to savannahs and forests. And this was the third year that the bar and grassy prairies, watered by 1,000 rivers, always begun light by 1,000 warlike till 4 men was killed, passed beneath and the scepter of the Sultan come any more after that, and all by virtue of a feeble human voice. Would stand it one more night and was going on like that, but the men had got enough. They started to get out a boat to take him ashore and lynch him, but he grabbed the little child all of a sudden and jumped overboard with it hugged up to his breast and shedding tears, and we never see him again in this life, poor old suffering soul. Nor Charles William neither, who was shedding tears. Says Bob, was it Albright or the baby? Why, Albright, of course. Didn't I tell you the baby was dead? Been dead 3 years, how could it cry? Well, never mind how it could cry, how could it keep all that time, says Davy. You answer me that. I don't know how it done it, says Ed. It done it though, that's all I know about it. Say, what did they do with the bar, says the child of calamity. Why, they hove it overboard, and it sunk like a chunk of lead. Edward, did the child look like it was choked, says one. Did it have its hair parted, says another. What was the brand on that bar, Eddie, says a fellow they called Bill. Have you got the papers for them statistics, Edmund, says Jimmy. Say, Edwin, was you one of the men that was killed by the lightning, says Davy. Him. Oh, no, he was both of 'em, says Bob. Then they all haw-hawed. Say, Edward, don't you reckon you'd better take a pill? You look bad, don't you feel pale, says the child of calamity. Oh, come, now, Eddie, says Jimmy, show up, you must a kept part of that bar to prove the thing by. Show us the bunghole do and we'll all believe you. Say, boys, says Bill, let's divide it up. There's 13 of us. I can swaller a 13th of the yarn, if you can worry down the rest. Ed got up mad and said they could all go to some place, which he ripped out pretty savage, and then walked off aft cussing to himself, and they yelling and jeering at him, and roaring and laughing so you could hear them a mile. Boys, we'll split a watermelon on that, says the child of calamity, and he come rummaging around in the dark amongst the shingle bundles where I was, and put his hand on me. I was warm and soft and naked, so he says ouch, and jumped back. Fetch a lantern or a chunk of fire here, boys, there's a snake here as big as a cow. So they run there with a lantern and crowded up and looked in on me. Come out of that, you beggar, says one. Who are you, says another. What are you after here? Speak up prompt, or overboard you go. Snake him out, boys. Snatch him out by the heels. I began to beg, and crept out amongst them trembling. They looked me over, wondering, and the child of calamity says, "A cussed thief. Lend a hand and let's heave him overboard." "No," says Big Bob, "let's get out the paint pot and paint him a sky blue all over from head to heel, and then heave him over." "Good, that's it. Go for the paint, Jimmy." When the paint come, and Bob took the brush and was just going to begin, the others laughing and rubbing their hands, I begun to cry, and that sort of worked on Davy, and he says, "Vast there. He's nothing but a cub. I'll paint the man that touches him." So I looked around on them, and some of them grumbled and growled, and Bob put down the paint, and the others didn't take it up. "Come here to the fire, and let's see what you're up to here," says Davy. "Now sit down there and give an account of yourself. How long have you been aboard here?" "Not over a quarter of a minute, sir," says I. "How did you get dry so quick?" "I don't know, sir. I'm always that way, mostly." "Oh, you are you? What's your name?" I warn't going to tell my name. I didn't know what to say, so I just says, "Charles William Albright, sir." Then they roared, the whole crowd, and I was mighty glad I said that, because maybe laughing would get them in a better humor. When they got done laughing, Davy says, "It won't hardly do, Charles William. You couldn't have growed this much in 5 year, and you was a baby when you come out of the bar, you know, and dead at that. Come, now, tell a straight story, and nobody'll hurt you, if you ain't up to anything wrong. What is your name?" "Alec Hopkins, sir." "Alec James Hopkins. Well, Alec, where did you come from, here?" "From a trading scow. She lays up the bend yonder. I was born on her. Pap has traded up and down here all his life, and he told me to swim off here, because when you went by he said he would like to get some of you to speak to a Mr. Jonas Turner in Cairo and tell him." "Oh, come." "Yes, sir, it's as true as the world, Pap," he says. "Oh, your grandmother." They all laughed, and I tried again to talk, but they broke in on me and stopped me. "Now, looky here," says Davy, "you're scared, and so you talk wild. Honest, now, do you live in a scow, or is it a lie?" "Yes, sir, in a trading scow. She lays up at the head of the bend. But I warn't born in her. It's our first trip." "Now you're talking. What did you come aboard here for? To steal?" "No, sir, I didn't. It was only to get a ride on the raft. All boys does that." "Well, I know that. But what did you hide for?" "Sometimes they drive the boys off." "So they do. They might steal. Looky here, if we let you off this time, will you keep out of these kind of scrapes hereafter?" "'Deed I will, boss." "You try me." "All right, then. You ain't but little ways from shore. Overboard with you, and don't you make a fool of yourself another time this way, blasted, boy, some raftsman would rawhide you till you were black and blue." I didn't wait to kiss goodbye, but went overboard and broke for shore. When Jim come along by and by, the big raft was away out of sight around the point. I swum out and got aboard, and was mighty glad to see home again. The boy did not get the information he was after, but his adventure has furnished the glimpse of the departed raftsman and keelboatman which I desire to offer in this place. I now come to a phase of the Mississippi River life of the flush times of steamboating, which seems to me to warrant full examination, the marvelous science of piloting, as displayed there. I believe there has been nothing like it elsewhere in the world. Chapter 4. The Boy's Ambition. When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village. *1. Hannibal, Missouri, on the west bank of the Mississippi River. That was, to be a steamboatman. We had transient ambitions of other sorts, but they were only transient. When a circus came and went, it left us all burning to become clowns. The first Negro minstrel show that came to our section left us all suffering to try that kind of life. Now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. These ambitions faded out, each in its turn, but the ambition to be a steamboatman always remained. Once a day a cheap, gaudy packet arrived upward from St. Louis, and another downward from Keokuk. Before these events, the day was glorious with expectancy; after them, the day was a dead and empty thing. Not only the boys, but the whole village, felt this. After all these years I can picture that old time to myself now, just as it was then, the white town drowsing in the sunshine of a summer's morning, the streets empty, or pretty nearly so, one or two clerks sitting in front of the Water Street stores, with their splint-bottomed chairs tilted back against the wall, chins on breasts, hats slouched over their faces, asleep with shingle shavings enough around to show what broke them down, a sow and a litter of pigs loafing along the sidewalk, doing a good business in watermelon rinds and seeds, 2 or 3 lonely little freight piles scattered about the levee, a pile of skids on the slope of the stone-paved wharf, and the fragrant town drunkard asleep in the shadow of them, 2 or 3 wood flats at the head of the wharf, but nobody to listen to the peaceful lapping of the wavelets against them, the great Mississippi, the majestic, the magnificent Mississippi, rolling its mile-wide tide along, shining in the sun, the dense forest. Away on the other side, the point above the town, and the point below, bounding the river glimpse and turning it into a sort of sea, and withal a very still and brilliant and lonely one. Presently a film of dark smoke appears above one of those remote points, instantly a negro drayman, famous for his quick eye and prodigious voice, lifts up the cry, "Steam boat a comin'," and the scene changes. The town drunkard stirs, the clerks wake up, a furious clatter of drays follows, every house and store pours out a human contribution, and all in a twinkling the dead town is alive and moving. Drays, carts, men, boys, all go hurrying from many quarters to a common center, the wharf. Assembled there, the people fasten their eyes upon the coming boat as upon a wonder they are seeing for the first time. And the boat is rather a handsome sight, too. She is long and sharp and trim and pretty, she has 2 tall, fancy-topped chimneys, with a gilded device of some kind swung between them, a fanciful pilot house, a glass and gingerbread, perched on top of the Texas deck behind them. The paddle boxes are gorgeous with a picture or with gilded rays above the boat's name. The boiler deck, the hurricane deck, and the Texas deck are fenced and ornamented with clean white railings. There is a flag gallantly flying from the jackstaff, the furnace. Doors are open and the fires glaring bravely. The upper decks are black with passengers. The captain stands by the big bell, calm, imposing, the envy of all. Great volumes of the blackest smoke are rolling and tumbling out of the chimneys, a husband grandeur created with a bit of pitch pine just before arriving at a town. The crew are grouped on the forecastle, the broad stage is run far out over the port bow, and an envied deckhand stands picturesquely on the end of it with a coil of rope in his hand. The pent steam is screaming through the gauge cocks, the captain lifts his hand, a bell rings, the wheels stop, then they turn back, churning the water to foam, and the steamer is at rest. Then such a scramble as there is to get aboard, and to get ashore, and to take in freight and to discharge freight, all at one and the same time, and such a yelling and cursing as the mates facilitate it all with. 10 minutes later the steamer is under way again, with no flag on the jackstaff and no black smoke issuing from the chimneys. After 10 more minutes the town is dead again, and the town drunkard asleep by the skids once more. My father was a justice of the peace, and I supposed he possessed the power of life and death over all men and could hang anybody that offended him. This was distinction enough for me as a general thing, but the desire to be a steamboatman kept intruding, nevertheless. I first wanted to be a cabin boy, so that I could come out with a white apron on and shake a tablecloth over the side, where all my old comrades could see me. Later I thought I would rather be the deckhand who stood on the end of the stage plank with the coil of rope in his hand, because he was particularly conspicuous. But these were only daydreams, they were too heavenly to be contemplated as real possibilities. By and by one of our boys went away. He was not heard of for a long time. At last he turned up as apprentice engineer or striker on a steamboat. This thing shook the bottom out of all my Sunday school teachings. That boy had been notoriously worldly, and I just the reverse, yet he was exalted to this eminence, and I left in obscurity and misery. There was nothing generous about this fellow in his greatness. He would always manage to have a rusty bolt to scrub while his boat tarried at our town, and he would sit on the inside guard and scrub it, where we could all see him and envy him and loathe him. And whenever his boat was laid up he would come home and swell around the town in his blackest and greasiest clothes, so that nobody could help remembering that he was a steamboatman, and he used all sorts of steamboat technicalities in his talk, as if he were so used to them that he forgot common people could not understand them. He would speak of the larboard side of a horse in an easy, natural way that would make one wish he was dead. And he was always talking about St. Louis like an old citizen. He would refer casually to occasions when he was coming down 4th Street, or when he was passing by the planter's house, or when there was a fire and he took a turn on the brakes of the old big Missouri, and then he would go on and lie about how many towns the size of ours were burned down there that day. 2 or 3 of the boys had long been persons of consideration among us because they had been to St. Louis once and had a vague general knowledge of its wonders, but the day of their glory was over now. They lapsed into a humble silence, and learned to disappear when the ruthless cub engineer approached. This fellow had money, too, and hair oil. Also an ignorant silver watch and a showy brass watch chain. He wore a leather belt and used no suspenders. If ever a youth was cordially admired and hated by his comrades, this one was. No girl could withstand his charms. He cut out every boy in the village. When his boat blew up at last, it diffused a tranquil contentment among us such as we had not known for months. But when he came home the next week, alive, renowned, and appeared in church all battered up and bandaged, a shining hero, stared at and wondered over by everybody, it seemed to us that the partiality of Providence for an undeserving reptile had reached a point where it was open to criticism. This creature's career could produce but one result, and it speedily followed. Boy after boy managed to get on the river. The minister's son became an engineer. The doctor's and the postmaster's sons became mud clerks, the wholesale liquor dealer's son became a barkeeper on a boat, 4 sons of the chief merchant, and 2 sons of the county judge, became pilots. Pilot was the grandest position of all. The pilot, even in those days of trivial wages, had a princely salary from $150 to $250 a month, and no board to pay. 2 months of his wages would pay a preacher's salary for a year. Now some of us were left disconsolate. We could not get on the river, at least our parents would not let us. So by and by I ran away. I said I never would come home again till I was a pilot and could come in glory. But somehow I could not manage it. I went meekly aboard a few of the boats that lay packed together like sardines at the long St. Louis wharf, and very humbly inquired for the pilots, but got only a cold shoulder and short words from mates and clerks. I had to make the best of this sort of treatment for the time being, but I had comforting daydreams of a future when I should be a great and honored pilot, with plenty of money, and could kill some of these mates and clerks and pay for them. Chapter 5. I want to be a cub pilot. Months afterward the hope within me struggled to a reluctant death, and I found myself without an ambition. But I was ashamed to go home. I was in Cincinnati, and I set to work to map out a new career. I had been reading about the recent exploration of the river Amazon by an expedition sent out by our government. It was said that the expedition, owing to difficulties, had not thoroughly explored a part of the country lying about the headwaters, some 4,000 miles from the mouth of the river. It was only about 1,500 miles from Cincinnati to New Orleans, where I could doubtless get a ship. I had $30 left. I would go and complete the exploration of the Amazon. This was all the thought I gave to the subject. I never was great in matters of detail. I packed my valise, and took passage on an ancient tub called the Paul Jones, for New Orleans. For the sum of $16 I had the scarred and tarnished splendors of her main saloon principally to myself, for she was not a creature to attract the eye of wiser travelers. When we presently got under way and went poking down the broad Ohio, I became a new being, and the subject of my own admiration. I was a traveler. A word never had tasted so good in my mouth before. I had an exultant sense of being bound for mysterious lands and distant climes which I never have felt in so uplifting a degree since. I was in such a glorified condition that all ignoble feelings departed out of me, and I was able to look down and pity the untraveled with a compassion that had hardly a trace of contempt in it. Still, when we stopped at villages and wood yards, I could not help lolling carelessly upon the railings of the boiler deck to enjoy the envy of the country boys on the bank. If they did not seem to discover me, I presently sneezed to attract their attention, or moved to a position where they could not help seeing me. And as soon as I knew they saw me, I gaped and stretched, and gave other signs of being mightily bored with traveling. I kept my hat off all the time, and stayed where the wind and the sun could strike me, because I wanted to get the bronzed and weather-beaten look of an old traveler. Before the second day was half gone, I experienced a joy which filled me with the purest gratitude, for I saw that the skin had begun to blister and peel off my face and neck. I wished that the boys and girls at home could see me now. We reached Louisville in time, at least the neighborhood of it. We stuck hard and fast on the rocks in the middle of the river, and lay there 4 days. I was now beginning to feel a strong sense of being a part of the boat's family, a sort of infant son to the captain and younger brother to the officers. There is no estimating the pride I took in this grandeur, or the affection that began to swell and grow in me for those people. I could not know how the lordly steamboatman scorns that sort of presumption in a mere landsman. I particularly longed to acquire the least trifle of notice from the big stormy mate, and I was on the alert for an opportunity to do him a service to that end. It came at last. The riotous powwow of setting a spar was going on down on the forecastle, and I went down there and stood around in the way, or mostly skipping out of it, till the mate suddenly roared a general order for somebody to bring him a capstan bar. I sprang to his side and said, "Tell me where it is, I'll fetch it." If a ragpicker had offered to do a diplomatic service for the Emperor of Russia, the monarch could not have been more astounded than the mate was. He even stopped swearing. He stood and stared down at me. It took him 10 seconds to scrape his disjointed remains together again. Then he said impressively, "Well, if this don't beat hell," and turned to his work with the air of a man who had been confronted with a problem too abstruse for solution. I crept away, and courted solitude for the rest of the day. I did not go to dinner, I stayed away from supper until everybody else had finished. I did not feel so much like a member of the boat's family now as before. However, my spirits returned, in installments, as we pursued our way down the river. I was sorry I hated the mate so, because it was not in human nature not to admire him. He was huge and muscular, his face was bearded and whiskered all over, he had a red woman and a blue woman tattooed on his right arm, one on each side of a blue anchor with a red rope to it, and in the matter of profanity he was sublime. When he was getting out cargo at a landing, I was always where I could see and hear. He felt all the majesty of his great position, and made the world feel it, too. When he gave even the simplest order, he discharged it like a blast of lightning, and sent a long, reverberating peal of profanity thundering after it. I could not help contrasting the way in which the average landsman would give an order, with the mate's way of doing it. If the landsman should wish the gangplank moved a foot farther forward, he would probably say, "James, or William, one of you push that plank forward, please," but put the mate in his place and he would roar out, "Here, now, start that gangplank for art. Lively, now. What are you about? Snatch it. Snatch it. There. There. Aft again. Aft again. Don't you hear me? Dash it to dash. Are you going to sleep over it? Vast heaving. Vast heaving, I tell you. Going to heave it clear astern? Where are you going with that barrel? For'ard with it, for I make you swallow it, you dash 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 dash." Split between a tired mud turtle and a crippled hearse horse. I wished I could talk like that. When the soreness of my adventure with the mate had somewhat worn off, I began timidly to make up to the humblest official connected with the boat, the night watchman. He snubbed my advances at first, but I presently ventured to offer him a new chalk pipe, and that softened him. So he allowed me to sit with him by the big bell on the hurricane deck, and in time he melted into conversation. He could not well have helped it, I hung with such homage on his words and so plainly showed that I felt honored by his notice. He told me the names of dim capes and shadowy islands as we glided by them in the solemnity of the night, under the winking stars, and by got to talking about himself. He seemed over-sentimental for a man whose salary was $6 a week, or rather he might have seemed so to an older person than I. But I drank in his words hungrily, and with a faith that might have moved mountains if it had been applied judiciously. What was it to me that he was soiled and seedy and fragrant with gin? What was it to me that his grammar was bad, his construction worse, and his profanity so void of art that it was an element of weakness rather than strength in his conversation? He was a wronged man, a man who had seen trouble, and that was enough for me. As he mellowed into his plaintive history, his tears dripped upon the lantern in his lap, and I cried, too, from sympathy. He said he was the son of an English nobleman, either an earl or an alderman, he could not remember which, but believed was both. His father, the nobleman, loved him, but his mother hated him from the cradle, and so while he was still a little boy he was sent to one of them old, ancient colleges, he couldn't remember which, and by his father died and his mother seized the property and shook him, as he phrased it. After his mother shook him, members of the nobility with whom he was acquainted used their influence to get him the position of loblolly boy in a ship, and from that point my watchman threw off all trammels of date and locality and branched out into a narrative that bristled all along with incredible adventures, a narrative that was so reeking with bloodshed and so crammed with hairbreadth escapes and the most engaging and unconscious personal villainies, that I sat speechless, enjoying, shuddering, wondering, worshipping. It was a sore blight to find out afterwards that he was a low, vulgar, ignorant, sentimental, half-witted humbug, an untraveled native of the wilds of Illinois, who had absorbed wildcat literature and appropriated its marvels, until in time he had woven odds and ends of the mess into this yarn, and then gone on telling it to fledglings like me, until he had come to believe it himself. Chapter 6. A Cub Pilot's Experience. What with lying on the rocks 4 days at Louisville, and some other delays, the poor old Paul Jones fooled away about 2 weeks in making the voyage from Cincinnati to New Orleans. This gave me a chance to get acquainted with one of the pilots, and he taught me how to steer the boat, and thus made the fascination of river life more potent than ever for me. It also gave me a chance to get acquainted with a youth who had taken deck passage, more's the pity, for he easily borrowed $6 of me on a promise to return to the boat and pay it back to me the day after we should arrive. But he probably died or forgot, for he never came. It was doubtless the former, since he had said his parents were wealthy, and he only traveled deck passage because it was cooler. Footnote 1. Deck passage, i.e. steerage passage. I soon discovered 2 things. One was that a vessel would not be likely to sail for the mouth of the Amazon under 10 or 12 years, and the other was that the $9 or $10 still left in my pocket would not suffice for so imposing an exploration as I had planned, even if I could afford to wait for a ship. Therefore it followed that I must contrive a new career. The Paul Jones was now bound for St. Louis. I planned a siege against my pilot, and at the end of 3 hard days he surrendered. He agreed to teach me the Mississippi River from New Orleans to St. Louis for $500, payable out of the first wages I should receive after graduating. I entered upon the small enterprise of learning 12 or 1300 miles of the great Mississippi River with the easy confidence of my time of life. If I had really known what I was about to require of my faculties, I should not have had the courage to begin. I supposed that all a pilot had to do was to keep his boat in the river, and I did not consider that that could be much of a trick, since it was so wide. The boat backed out from New Orleans at 4 in the afternoon, and it was our watch until 8. Mr. Bixby, my chief, straightened her up, plowed her along past the sterns of the other boats that lay at the levee, and then said, "Here, Take her, shave those steamships as close as you'd peel an apple. I took the wheel, and my heartbeat fluttered up into the hundreds, for it seemed to me that we were about to scrape the side off every ship in the line, we were so close. I held my breath and began to claw the boat away from the danger, and I had my own opinion of the pilot who had known no better than to get us into such peril, but I was too wise to express it. In half a minute I had a wide margin of safety intervening between the Paul Jones and the ships, and within 10 seconds more I was set aside in disgrace, and Mr. Bixby was going into danger again and flaying me alive with abuse of my cowardice. I was stung, but I was obliged to admire the easy confidence with which my chief loafed from side to side of his wheel, and trimmed the ship so closely that disaster seemed ceaselessly imminent. When he had cooled a little he told me that the easy water was close ashore and the current outside, and therefore we must hug the bank, upstream, to get the benefit of the former, and stay well out, downstream, to take advantage of the latter. In my own mind I resolved to be a downstream pilot and leave the upstreaming to people dead to prudence. Now and then Mr. Bixby called my attention to certain things. Said he, "This is 6 Mile Point." I assented. It was pleasant enough information, but I could not see the bearing of it. I was not conscious that it was a matter of any interest to me. Another time he said, "This is 9 Mile Point." Later he said, "This is 12 Mile Point." They were all about level with the water's edge, they all looked about alike to me, they were monotonously unpicturesque. I hoped Mr. Bixby would change the subject. But no, he would crowd up around a point, hugging the shore with affection, and then say, "The slack water ends here, abreast this bunch of China trees, now we cross over." So he crossed over. He gave me the wheel once or twice, but I had no luck. I either came near chipping off the edge of a sugar plantation, or I yawed too far from shore, and so dropped back into disgrace again and got abused. The watch was ended at last, and we took supper and went to bed. At midnight the glare of a lantern shone in my eyes, and the night watchman said, "Come. Turn out." And then he left. I could not understand this extraordinary procedure, so I presently gave up trying to, and dozed off to sleep. Pretty soon the watchman was back again, and this time he was gruff. I was annoyed. I said, "What do you want to come bothering around here in the middle of the night for? Now as like as not I'll not get to sleep again tonight." The watchman said, "Well, if this ain't good, I'm blessed." The off-watch was just turning in, and I heard some brutal laughter from them, and such remarks as, "Hello, watchman. Ain't the new cub turned out yet? He's delicate, likely. Give him some sugar in a rag and send for the chambermaid to sing Rock-a-Bye Baby to him." About this time Mr. Bixby appeared on the scene. Something like a minute later I was climbing the pilot house steps with some of my clothes on and the rest in my arms. Mr. Bixby was close behind, commenting. Here was something fresh, this thing of getting up in the middle of the night to go to work. It was a detail in piloting that had never occurred to me at all. I knew that boats ran all night, but somehow I had never happened to reflect that somebody had to get up out of a warm bed to run them. I began to fear that piloting was not quite so romantic as I had imagined it was. There was something very real and work-like about this new phase of it. It was a rather dingy night, although a fair number of stars were out. The big mate was at the wheel, and he had the old tub pointed at a star and was holding her straight up the middle of the river. The shores on either hand were not much more than half a mile apart, but they seemed wonderfully far away and ever so vague and indistinct. The mate said, "We've got to land at Jones's plantation, sir." The vengeful spirit in me exulted. I said to myself, "I wish you joy of your job, Mr. Bixby. You'll have a good time finding Mr. Jones's plantation such a night as this, and I hope you never will find it as long as you live." Mr. Bixby said to the mate, "Upper end of the plantation, or the lower?" "Upper." "I can't do it. The stumps there are out of water at this stage, it's no great distance to the lower, and you'll have to get along with that." "All right, sir." If Jones don't like it he'll have to lump it, I reckon. And then the mate left. My exultation began to cool and my wonder to come up. Here was a man who not only proposed to find this plantation on such a night, but to find either end of it you preferred. I dreadfully wanted to ask a question, but I was carrying about as many short answers as my cargo room would admit of, so I held my peace. All I desired to ask Mr. Bixby was the simple question whether he was ass enough to really imagine he was going to find that plantation on a night when all plantations were exactly alike and all the same color. But I held in. I used to have fine inspirations of prudence in those days. Mr. Bixby made for the shore and soon was scraping it, just the same as if it had been daylight. And not only that, but singing, "Father in heaven, the day is declining," etc. It seemed to me that I had put my life in the keeping of a peculiarly reckless outcast. Presently he turned on me and said, "What's the name of the first point above New Orleans?" I was gratified to be able to answer promptly, and I did. I said I didn't know. Don't know. This manner jolted me. I was down at the foot again, in a moment. But I had to say just what I had said before. "Well, you're a smart one," said Mr. Bixby. "What's the name of the next point?" Once more I didn't know. "Well, this beats anything. Tell me the name of any point or place I told you." I studied a while and decided that I couldn't. "Look here. What do you start out from, above 12-Mile Point, to cross over?" I don't know." You don't know," mimicking my drawling manner of speech. "What do you know?" I nothing, for certain." "By the great Caesar's ghost, I believe you. You're the stupidest dunderhead I ever saw or ever heard of, so help me Moses. The idea of you being a pilot you. Why, you don't know enough to pilot a cow down a lane." Oh, but his wrath was up. He was a nervous man, and he shuffled from one side of his wheel to the other as if the floor was hot. He would boil a while to himself, and then overflow and scald me again. "Look here. What do you suppose I told you the names of those points for?" I tremblingly considered a moment, and then the devil of temptation provoked me to say. Well, to be entertaining, I thought. This was a red rag to the bull. He raged and stormed so, he was crossing the river at the time, that I judge it made him blind, because he ran over the steering oar of a trading scow. Of course the traders sent up a volley of red-hot profanity. Never was a man so grateful as Mr. Bixby was, because he was brimful, and here were subjects who would talk back. He threw open a window, thrust his head out, and such an eruption followed as I never had heard before. The fainter and farther away the scowman's curses drifted, the higher Mr. Bixby lifted his voice and the weightier his adjectives grew. When he closed the window he was empty. You could have drawn a seine through his system and not caught curses enough to disturb your mother with. Presently he said to me in the gentlest way, "My boy, you must get a little memorandum book, and every time I tell you a thing, put it down right away. There's only one way to be a pilot, and that is to get this entire river by heart. You have to know it just like ABC." That was a dismal revelation to me, for my memory was never loaded with anything but blank cartridges. However, I did not feel discouraged long. I judged that it was best to make some allowances, for doubtless Mr. Bixby was stretching. Presently he pulled a rope and struck a few strokes on the big bell. The stars were all gone now, and the night was as black as ink. I could hear the wheels churn along the bank, but I was not entirely certain that I could see the shore. The voice of the invisible watchman called up from the hurricane deck. "What's this, sir?" "Jones's plantation." I said to myself, I wish I might venture to offer a small bet that it isn't. But I did not chirp. I only waited to see. Mr. Bixby handled the engine bells, and in due time the boat's nose came to the land, a torch glowed from the forecastle, a man skipped ashore, a dark's voice on the bank said, "Gimme de yarpet bag, Mars Jones," and the next moment we were standing up the river again, all serene. I reflected deeply a while, and then said but not aloud, well, the finding of that plantation was the luckiest accident that ever happened, but it couldn't happen again in 100 years. And I fully believed it was an accident, too. By the time we had gone 700 or 800 miles up the river, I had learned to be a tolerably plucky upstream steersman in daylight, and before we reached St. Louis the first had made a trifle of progress in night work, but only a trifle. I had a notebook that fairly bristled with the names of towns, points, bars, islands, bends, reaches, etc., but the information was to be found only in the notebook, none of it was in my head. It made my heart ache to think I had only got half of the river set down, for as our watch was 4 hours off and 4 hours on, day and night, there was a long 4-hour gap in my book for every time I had slept since the voyage began. My chief was presently hired to go on a big New Orleans boat, and I packed my satchel and went with him. She was a grand affair. When I stood in her pilot house I was so far above the water that I seemed perched on a mountain, and her decks stretched so far away, fore and aft, below me, that I wondered how I could ever have considered the little Paul Jones a large craft. There were other differences, too. The Paul Jones's pilot house was a cheap, dingy, battered rattletrap, cramped for room, but here was a sumptuous glass temple, room enough to have a dance in, showy red and gold window curtains, an imposing sofa, leather cushions and a back to the high bench where visiting pilots sit, to spin yarns and look at the river, bright, fanciful cuspidors instead of a broad wooden box filled with sawdust, nice new oilcloth on the floor, a hospitable big stove for winter, a wheel as high as my head, costly with inlaid work, a wire tiller rope, bright brass knobs for the bells, and a tidy, white aproned, black Texas tender, to bring up tarts and ices and coffee during mid-watch, day and night. Now this was something like, and so I began to take heart once more to believe that piloting was a romantic sort of occupation after all. The moment we were underway I began to prowl about the great steamer and fill myself with joy. She was as clean and as dainty as a drawing room. When I looked down her long, gilded saloon, it was like gazing through a splendid tunnel. She had an oil picture, by some gifted sign painter, on every stateroom door. She glittered with no end of prism-fringed chandeliers. The clerk's office was elegant, the bar was marvelous, and the barkeeper had been barbered and upholstered at incredible cost. The boiler deck, i.e. the second story of the boat, so to speak, was as spacious as a church, it seemed to me, so with the forecastle, and there was no pitiful handful of deckhands, firemen and roustabouts down there, but a whole battalion of men. The fires were fiercely glaring from a long row of furnaces, and over them were 8 huge boilers. This was unutterable pomp. The mighty engines, but enough of this. I had never felt so fine before. And when I found that the regiment of natty servants respectfully served me, my satisfaction was complete.